The orchestra had stopped between figures, and into that small silence the footman's voice fell like a dropped tray. "You struck a duchess," he said, and pointed one white-gloved hand across the length of the ballroom at a woman in gray. Every candle in the chandeliers of Harrogate House seemed to lean toward her at once. 200 faces turned in a single motion, the way a field of wheat turns under a sudden wind, and at the center of all that turning stood Cassandra Vane, 26 years old, a music copyist hired for the evening, with a child's small hand still clutched in her own, and a red mark blooming on her own cheekbone, where a heavy ringed hand had landed first. She did not let go of the child. That was the thing the room would remember afterward, though it could not yet see why. She stood very straight in a gown the color of ash, the one good gown she owned, retrimmed twice and pressed that morning with a flat iron borrowed from the kitchen, and she kept her arm around the shoulders of a boy of perhaps 6 who was shaking against her side. Her chin did not drop, her eyes did not search the floor for mercy. What she felt was not yet fear, only a strange clarity, the clarity of a person who has already lost most of what can be lost, and finds the rest oddly weightless. The accusation had a shape the room understood instantly, because the room had been built to understand exactly this. A woman of no name had laid hands on a woman of the highest name. There was a duchess present, the Dowager Duchess of Harrogate, and she stood near the terrace doors with a hand pressed to her bodice and her diamonds trembling at her throat, performing an outrage so practiced it might have been rehearsed. Around her the guests arranged themselves into the verdict they already held. Cassandra saw it happen. She had spent her life watching rooms decide things about her before she spoke, and she watched this room decide now. What none of them had seen, because they had been attending to the music and to one another, was the moment before. They had not seen the dowager's gloved hand close on the boy's ear and twist, because the child had wandered too near her skirts and trodden on the hem with a muddy slipper. They had not seen the boy cry out. They had not seen Cassandra cross from the musician's alcove without thinking, the way a hand moves to a flame before the mind consents, and put her own body between the child and the second blow. The ringed hand had caught her across the face instead. The room had turned only in time to see a gray woman near a great lady, and a great lady recoiling, and a footman who knew which side his living was buttered on. If you have ever stood in a room that had already made up its mind about you, you know the particular cold of that moment. Stay with this one a little while. It does not end the way the footman believed it would. Cassandra Vane had not been born to copy music for other people's parties. Her father had been a gentleman of modest acres in Wiltshire, a man who loved Mozart more than money, and proved it by leaving very little of the second and a great deal of the first. He had taught her to read a score before she could read a letter, to hear the architecture inside a sonata, to set down notes in a clean hand that singers and players could trust. When the fever took him in her 23rd year, it took the house with him. For the small estate was entailed away to a cousin who arrived within the month to measure the windows. She had walked out of her childhood with a trunk of scores, her mother's wedding ring, and a single miniature of her father painted when he was young, his violin tucked under his chin and his eyes full of some private music. The ring she had sold by the second winter, the miniature she had not. For 3 years she had lived by her pen. She copied parts for a music seller in a narrow street, fair copied songs for ladies who wished to seem accomplished, and when a great house gave a ball she was sometimes hired to sit in the alcove and mend the players' parts when a page tore or a candle guttered wax across a line. It was honest work, and it was invisible work, which suited her, for invisibility had become a kind of armor. To the houses that hired her she was nobody. To the season, she did not exist at all. The room had decided she was furniture, and she had let it, because furniture is not asked to dance, and is not asked to explain itself, and is not, on most nights, struck. The Harrogate ball was the largest engagement she had been given that year. She had arrived through the servants' entrance at 4, set her satchel of spare paper and sharpened pens on the little table behind the screen, and watched the great rooms fill from her place at the edge of everything. She had watched the dowager arrive last and loudest. She had watched the rival of the season, Lady Augusta Pell, sweep in on her brother's arm in a gown of ice-blue silk that cost more than Cassandra would earn in a decade. And she had watched, without meaning to, the master of the house come down the stairs. Julian Thorne, the Duke of Harrowgate, was not a man people approached without invitation. He was perhaps 34, tall and broad through the shoulder, with dark hair cut close and a jaw that looked carved rather than grown. He wore a coat of deep navy and a cravat tied with no ornament at all, and he moved through his own ballroom the way a tide moves through a harbor, without hurry and without consulting anyone. He had inherited the title, 18 months before, the season said, after the death of his elder brother, and he had not smiled once in all that time that anyone could report. The mothers of the season had laid siege to him and broken against him. He was, the room agreed, the coldest man in England, and the coldest man in England now stood at the foot of his own staircase and looked across his ballroom at the place where a footman was pointing. The boy at Cassandra's side was his. She had not known it when she stepped between the child and the dowager. She had known only that he was small and frightened, and being hurt. His name was Thomas, and he was the Duke's ward, the orphaned son of the dead brother, a quiet child who had slipped his nurse and gone wandering toward the music because he liked it the way his uncle's whole family had once liked it before grief closed the lid of the instrument. None of this Cassandra knew as she held him. She knew the weight of him against her hip and the wet of his crying through the thin gray silk. To the dowager she was, of course, a thief and a brute. Lady Harrowgate found her voice as the Duke crossed the first 10 feet of the floor and used it generously. "The creature struck me," she said to the women nearest her, loud enough to carry a copyist, a paid hand, who forgot herself entirely. "Did you see it? You all saw it." The women murmured that they had, that they certainly had. That it was exactly the sort of thing one must expect when persons of that order were permitted near persons of quality. The label fixed itself in the air over Cassandra's head, where everyone could read it. A paid hand who forgot herself. The room held that sentence and was satisfied by it. Julian Thorne did not seem to hear it. He crossed his ballroom without haste, and the crowd opened before him because crowds always had, and he came to a halt 3 feet from the woman in gray and the trembling child she would not release. For a long moment he said nothing at all. He looked at the red mark on her cheek. He looked at the boy's tear-swollen face turned into her shoulder. He looked at the way her arm had locked around the child as if she meant to take any further blow herself before she would let it reach him. The room waited for him to have her removed. "Come here, Thomas," he said instead. His voice was low and level and carried to the far walls without rising. The boy lifted his face. And then, the part the room did not expect, the Duke went down on one knee in the middle of his own ballroom, in his navy coat, on the polished floor before all of them, and held out his hand to the child. Thomas hesitated, looked up at Cassandra as though asking permission to be brave, and then crossed the small distance and put his hand into his uncle's. The Duke drew the boy gently against him, and only then looked up at Cassandra, and what was in his face was not the cold the season had named. It was something that had not been used in a long time, and did not move easily. "What happened?" he said to her. "Not to the room. To her." Cassandra had prepared, in the half-minute available to her, to be turned out into the night without her fee and possibly without a character. She had not prepared to be asked. The question undid her composure more than the accusation had. She found that her voice, when she used it, was steadier than her hands. The child stepped where he ought not. "Your Grace," she said. He trod upon a hem. I removed him from where he stood. That was all. She did not say, "Whose hem?" She did not say, "Whose hand?" She had learned long ago that a woman of her station who accuses a woman of the dowager's station accuses only herself, and so she gave him the truth, shaved down to the part that could not be argued, and let the mark on her face say the rest. He looked at the mark again. The dowager had drawn breath to speak. and the Duke turned his head 1 degree toward her, and she did not speak. That single degree of his attention silenced a woman, accustomed to silencing rooms, and Cassandra saw several of the watching faces register it, a small ripple of recalculation passing through the crowd like wind crossing water. The footman who had pointed had gone the color of his own gloves. "You will not leave tonight," the Duke said to Cassandra. "You will sit, and you will be brought something, and someone will see to your face." He rose, the boy's hand still in his, and turned to a stout woman in black bombazine, who had appeared at the edge of the scene with the quiet inevitability of a good housekeeper. "Mrs. Finch," he said. "Miss Vane is to be made comfortable in the green room. The ball," he told the rest of them, "will continue." And the orchestra, taking its cue from the only authority in the room that mattered, lifted its bows, and the figures resumed, and the season closed over the incident, like water over a stone, and pretended it had not happened, and did not for a moment forget it. That was the first night. There would have been no story in it, only an evening's gossip. Had the Duke not done the second thing, which was to send for her again. The green room at Harrogate House had a fire, and a window that looked onto the dark garden, and Cassandra sat in it for an hour, with a cool cloth held to her cheek by Mrs. Finch's own steady hand. The housekeeper did not ask what had happened. She had been at Harrogate House for 30 years, and had a face that had stopped being surprised by the family some decades before. She asked instead whether Miss Vane had eaten, and when Miss Vane admitted that she had not since morning, a tray came, and on it was a supper finer than any Cassandra had been served in 3 years, and she ate it slowly and with great attention, while the music thudded faintly through the wall. It was nearly 2 in the morning when the door opened, and the Duke came in. He had loosened nothing, neither cravat nor manner, but the ballroom had emptied, and the house had gone quiet around them, and he came and stood by the fire, and looked at her in the firelight as though resuming a question he had set down. "The boy is asleep," he said. "He asked for you." Cassandra did not know what to do with that. She set down her cup. "He is a brave child," she said. "He was very frightened, and he tried not to show it." "You put yourself between him and her," the Duke said. It was not a question. He had reconstructed the half-second. The room had missed, perhaps from the boy, perhaps from the simple geometry of the marks. "My aunt does not strike children," he went on, in a voice gone carefully flat, "because it would be beneath her. She twists, she pinches, she does it where the gown will hide it. I have seen the bruises on his arm and been told he is clumsy." He stopped. His jaw worked once. "You saw it in an instant, and crossed a room you had no standing to cross." "Why?" "Because he is 6, Cassandra said simply. There was no other answer in her, and she did not look for a finer one. The Duke was quiet for a moment. Then he said the thing that began everything. "I am dismissing Thomas's nurse, who has stood by while this was done. The child needs someone in this house who will stand between him and harm without being asked to. You did it for a boy who was nothing to you. I am asking whether you would do it for wages, and a room and a place at this house as his governess." He named a sum that made the cloth go still against her cheek. It was 4 times what she earned with her pen. She should have wept with relief. Instead, she felt the old wariness rise, the instinct that taught a woman alone that nothing offered was free. "And the dowager," she said, "Lady Harrogate. She will not suffer me under this roof." The Duke's mouth did something that was not a smile, but was related to one, a distant cousin of a smile, glimpsed once and gone. "My aunt," he said, "will suffer a great many things she does not expect this season. The roof is mine." Then he said, "Come inside out of the cold, Miss Vane," which made no sense, for she was already inside and beside a fire. And yet she understood it perfectly, and something in her chest that had been clenched for 3 years loosened by the width of a hair. She took the post. Of course she took the post. A woman with a trunk of scores and a miniature of her dead father, does not refuse a room and 4 times her wages and a child who asked for her by name. She took it, though, the way one takes a hand crossing ice, testing each step, trusting nothing. And she moved into the small bright room beside the nursery the following week and began the work of teaching Thomas his letters and his scales, and more than either, the work of being a fixed point in a house where he had learned to flinch. The house was vast and cold and beautiful, and it was full of the absence of people who had died in it. Cassandra learned its absences the way she had once learned scores. There was a music room, with the instruments shrouded in holland covers, and the lid of the pianoforte closed and locked. There was a portrait gallery, where one frame hung with its face turned to the wall, and when she asked Mrs. Finch about it, the housekeeper said Donmay that it was the late Duchess, the Duke's brother's wife, and that His Grace did not care to look at it, and changed the subject with the firmness of long practice. There was the Duke himself, who appeared at the edges of Cassandra's days like weather, who watched his ward learn to laugh again with an expression she could not read, and who issued his small flat commands. Sit, eat, go in, it grows cold. She heard the coldness in them. It took her some weeks to begin to hear what lived underneath. What lived underneath was grief, and she came to it sideways through the child. Thomas told her things in the unguarded way of children. He told her that his mother and father had died in the same winter, his father of a fever, and his mother 3 months after, of something the household called a decline, and Thomas called sadness. He told her that his Uncle Julian had been away with the army when it happened, and had come home too late, and that his uncle did not play the pianoforte anymore, though he used to play it beautifully, and that the music room was locked, because of the Duchess who used to sing. Cassandra listened, and copied none of it down, and held all of it. She came to understand, across those weeks, the architecture of the man, the season, called cold. He had been the second son, the soldier, free of the title and its weight, when the fever took his brother. My! He had come home to bury a brother, and found a sister-in-law dying of grief, and a small boy no one was tending, and a great house full of relatives already dividing the spoils. He had taken the title he had never wanted, and the child no one else would love, and the silence where the music had been, and he had closed the lid of the instrument, and turned the portrait to the wall and made of himself a cold, still surface over a river that had not frozen at all, underneath only gone dark and gone deep. The dowager was his late brother's aunt by marriage, a woman whose whole consequence in the world derived from her connection to Harrogate, and who had moved into the house in the chaos of the deaths and made herself necessary, and now ruled the nursery and the menus and the invitation lists, as though she ruled the Duke himself. He suffered her, because removing her meant a fight, and he had been too tired and too closed to fight, until, it seemed, now, if this house has begun to feel real to you, if you find yourself listening for the locked pianoforte the way Cassandra did, then stay with her a while longer. The lid was going to open. It was only a question of whose hand would open it. The proximity did its quiet work. A governess and the master of a house occupy the same rooms at odd hours, cross the same corridors, lean over the same small boy's copybook to praise the same wobbling letters. Cassandra found that she knew where the Duke was in a room before she turned her head, that her body had learned the particular weight of his footstep on the gallery floor, that when his hand and hers reached at the same moment, for a fallen toy their fingers came within an inch of meeting and both of them went still. She told herself it was nothing. She told herself a great many things in those weeks, and her hands, raw still from 3 winters of cold rooms, betrayed her every time by trembling when he stood too near. He began to come to the nursery in the evenings. He said it was to hear the boy's progress, and the boy did progress. But the Duke stayed past the boy's bedtime more often than the boy's progress required, and he sat in the low chair by the fire that was too small for him, and watched Cassandra bank the coals and tidy the slates, and he talked to her. Not at first about anything that mattered, about the weather, the state of the roads, a book she had been reading that she had taken without asking from his library, which he had noticed, and did not mind. Then, one night, about his brother, He told her that his brother had taught him to ride. He told her that the pianoforte in the locked room had been a wedding gift to the Duchess, and that she had played it every evening of her marriage, and that the last time he heard it played was the night before he left for his regiment, and that he had stood in the doorway and been impatient to be gone, and would have given a great deal since to have that hour back. He had never said this to anyone. Cassandra understood that she was the first, and she held the knowledge the way she held the boy carefully, as a thing entrusted. "You should hear music in this house again," she said before she knew she meant to say it. The Duke looked at the fire for a long time. "The instrument is locked," he said. "The key is lost," she answered, "or so Mrs. Borey Finch tells me. And you have never sent for a locksmith, which means you do not wish it found." He did not deny it. After a while he said, very low, "I do not know how to begin a thing again once it has stopped." And she heard under the flat surface of the words the whole shape of his grief. And she did not reach for him, though her whole body wished to, because she was a governess and he was a duke, and the inch between their hands was a chasm the world would never permit them to cross. She only said, "Beginning again is not the same as forgetting. It is the opposite. The forgotten thing is gone. The remembered thing can be played." And the Duke looked at her then, in a way that frightened her with its nakedness, and rose and said, "Go to bed, Miss Vane. It grows late," and left. And she sat by the dying fire and pressed her cool hands to her hot face and understood that she was in very great danger of the only kind she had never learned to armor against. The Dowager, meanwhile, had not surrendered. She had merely changed her ground. She could not have Cassandra dismissed outright, for the Duke had made his protection plain, and the Dowager was not a fool. So she worked beneath the surface, in the way of people whose power runs through influence rather than authority. She let it be known among the season's hostesses that the new governess at Harrogate was the same creature who had assaulted her at the ball, that the Duke kept her on out of some misplaced softness, that the situation was irregular and bore watching. She arranged for Lady Augusta, the diamond of the season, to be much at Harrogate House, dining there, walking the gardens there, seated always at the Duke's right hand, the correct choice paraded before him at every turn. And she watched the governess, with the patience of a woman who has waited out better opponents than a copyist, and waited for Cassandra to give her the opening she needed. Cassandra gave her nothing. She kept to the nursery and the schoolroom, took her meals apart, lowered her eyes when the Dowager passed, and did her work so well that the boy bloomed under it like a plant brought in from frost. The Dowager voiced the label a second time, where it would do the most damage at her own dinner table, with 30 of the season's first people, seated under the blaze of the candles, and Lady Augusta at the Duke's right and Cassandra summoned, on the Dowager's instruction, to bring the boy down to make his bow to the company. She is a paid hand who forgot herself once already in this very county, the Dowager said, smiling, to the table at large as Cassandra stood in the doorway with the child's hand in hers. One does wonder at the wisdom of trusting such a person with a child. The table tittered. Lady Augusta smiled into her glass, and the Duke set down his knife with a small, precise click that stopped the laughter, and said, into the silence, "Thomas, come and tell your Aunt Augusta what you learned today." The deflection was perfect, and the rebuke inside it was unmistakable, and the Dowager's smile held its shape by main force, and Cassandra led the boy forward and felt the Duke's eyes on her. The whole length of the room. It could not last, this balance, and it did not. The Dowager, finding the Duke immovable and the governess unprovocable, did the thing such people do when patience fails them. She decided to remove the prize the governess did not yet know she was playing for. She would see the Duke engaged to Lady Augusta before the season ended, publicly, irrevocably, in this house. And she set the night for it. A great ball at Harrogate, larger than the first, at which the betrothal would be announced whether the Duke had quite agreed to it or not. The Dowager had announced betrothals into being before. A room full of witnesses and a toast already raised is difficult for even a Duke to refuse without a scene, and the Dowager was wagering that the Duke, who hated scenes above all things, who had built his whole cold surface to avoid them, would not make one. Cassandra learned of it from Mrs. Finch, who learned of everything. She received the knowledge standing in the cold music room, where she had taken to going alone in the evenings, drawn to the shrouded shapes and the locked instrument, the way one is drawn to press a bruise. She had brought her father's miniature with her, as she sometimes did, and was holding it in her palm, the young painted face and the violin beneath his chin, when Mrs. Finch told her kindly, because she thought Cassandra ought to know, that the Duke was to be engaged to Lady Augusta at the ball on Thursday, that the Dowager had arranged it all, and that Miss Vane was not, of course, to be present in the rooms, but might bring the boy down for the toast as before. Cassandra thanked her. She put the miniature back in her pocket. And she went up to the nursery and heard the boy's prayers and tucked the blanket to his chin. And only when his breathing had gone slow and even did she allow herself, in the dark of her own small room, to understand what she felt, which was grief, plain grief, the same grief she had felt walking out of her father's house. The grief of a thing being taken that she had been foolish enough to begin to want. She had broken her own first rule. She had let herself hope. The room had decided long ago what she was. A paid hand? Furniture? Nobody. And she had spent 3 years agreeing with the room. And somewhere in the warm evenings by the nursery fire she had stopped agreeing. And now the bill for that hope had come due. She did not weep. She had wept enough in her life to know its uses and its limits. She sat in the dark and held her own raw hands and made herself a smaller, harder promise, that she would see the boy safe, that she would stay as long as he needed her and the new Duchess permitted, and that she would not, on Thursday or any day after, let her face betray her. In front of the people who were waiting to read it. She was good at that. She had 3 years of practice at being unreadable. It was the one armor she had never lost. The Duke came to the nursery the night before the ball. He had not come for some evenings, and she had told herself it was the press of arrangements and known it was not. He stood in the doorway and did not sit. "You have heard," he said. It was not a question. She kept her hands busy with the slates. "I have heard there is to be a ball, Your Grace," she said, "and that it is a great deal of work for Mrs. Finch." He came into the room. "There is to be an announcement," he said. "My aunt has arranged it. Lady Augusta and I." Cassandra set the last slate in its rack with great care. "I wish you very happy," she said, in a voice scrubbed clean of everything. There was a silence. "Do you?" he said. And she made the mistake, the single mistake, of looking up. And he was looking at her with the river risen out of its banks at last. And neither of them said the thing, because she was a governess and he was a duke. And the announcement was made. And Cassandra stood among the slates with her clean, unreadable face, and her hands shaking like the last leaves on a tree. The night of the ball, Harrogate House blazed as it had on the first night, the chandeliers full of candles, the orchestra in its alcove, the season's 200 best arranged through the great rooms in their silks and their diamonds. The Dowager wore her finest, and moved among the guests like a general before a victory she considered already won. Lady Augusta wore white and silver, and stood near the Duke, and laughed at the correct moments. And in a corner of the gallery above, unseen, a governess in gray held a small boy by the hand, and waited to be summoned for the toast, and kept her face still, and kept her promise to herself, and did not look for the Duke in the crowd below, because she had learned that you cannot lose what you refuse to look at. It was Thomas who broke the geometry. The Dowager had sent up word that the boy was to be brought down, and Cassandra led him along the gallery, and down the great stair into the press and warmth of the ballroom. And as they reached the floor, the Dowager raised her hand for silence, and the orchestra stilled and the guests turned. The room arranged again to deliver a verdict. The Dowager began to speak. She spoke of the joining of 2 great houses, of the happiness of the family, of the honor done to Lady Augusta. She raised her glass. She turned smiling toward the Duke, to draw him into the toast that would commit him past retreat, And Thomas, 6 years old and frightened of the great lady who twisted, let go of Cassandra's hand and ran. He ran not to his uncle and not away, but to the only fixed, safe point his short life had taught him to trust, and he flung his arms around Cassandra's knees and pressed his face into the grey silk, and the whole room saw the Duke's ward turn from his great new aunt-to-be, and cling to the governess in front of everyone, and a small confused murmur began. And the dowager's smile faltered for the first time in the length of the story. 1 degree, the way a fan held too high, finally tires. The Duke looked at the boy clinging to the woman in grey. He looked at the glass raised in his aunt's hand, and the toast hanging unfinished in the air. He looked at Cassandra, who had bent to gather the child and whose unreadable face had for one unguarded instant become entirely readable, because she had not expected to be looked at. And what was written on it was love and grief, in equal measure, the love she had hidden for months and the grief of being about to lose it. The room held its breath. The dowager's glass waited. And the coldest man in England crossed his ballroom for the second time in this story, past his aunt, past Lady Augusta in her white and silver, past the raised glass and the unfinished toast, and came to a halt before the governess and the child, and went down on one knee on the polished floor, as he had the first night, but not to the boy this time. He took Cassandra's raw, trembling hand in both of his, before 200 witnesses, before the dowager and the rival and the whole arranged machinery of the evening, and he said the words that ended it. "I will marry the woman my son loves." The room went silent. It was a different silence than the first. Fuller, the silence of 200 people revising in a single instant everything they thought they had seen. The dowager's glass came down. It did not shatter, she set it down, but her hand was no longer steady, and the script that had worked in every room she had ever entered failed her in this one, and she opened her mouth and found nothing in it, and Lady Augusta, who was not a fool and had never wanted this match for love, but looked at the Duke, kneeling, and the governess weeping, and understood that she had been a piece on a board and was now removed from it, and did the one graceful thing available to her, which was to incline her head a fraction and step back. The crowd's murmur turned. Cassandra heard it turn. She had spent her life listening to rooms decide things about her, and she heard this room decide, in the space of a held breath, that it had been wrong, that the woman in grey was not what it had named her, that something true had happened in front of it, and could not be unhappened. She could not speak. The Duke was kneeling on his own floor, with her ruined hands in his, and the boy pressed between them, and the words he had said were rearranging the world, and her clean, unreadable face had broken entirely, and she did not care. "Your Grace," she managed. He shook his head once. "Julian," he said. "My name is Julian." He had never given it to her. She understood that it was the most extravagant thing he owned, and that he was placing it in her hands along with everything else. "Julian," she said, and saw the word land in him, and saw the river come all the way up over the dark ice and run free at last in his face, and she put her free hand against his cheek before all of them, breaking every rule the room had, and he turned his face into her palm the way a cold man turns toward the first fire of the winter. The dowager left Harrogate House within the week. She was not destroyed. The Duke was not a man for destruction. She was given a comfortable settlement and a small establishment in Bath, and she went, because there was nothing for her in a house that no longer ran on her authority, and she was clever enough to know it. Lady Augusta made a better match by Michaelmas to a man who wanted her for herself, and sent a card of congratulation that was only a little cold the season, talked for a month, and then, as seasons do, found something new. And at Harrogate House the lid of the pianoforte was opened. It was Cassandra who opened it, in the end, though Julian gave the order that found the locksmith. The music room was unshrouded, the holland covers folded away, the windows thrown up to the spring, and the portrait in the gallery was taken down from its place facing the wall and turned around at last, so that the late Duchess looked out once more over a house that had begun, very quietly, to make music again. Cassandra did not play it the first evening, nor the second. She waited until a night in late spring when the windows were open to the smell of cut grass, and Thomas had been allowed to stay up past his hour. And then she sat at the instrument the dead Duchess had loved, and played a simple thing. A song her father had taught her before she could read. And the notes went out into the house and up the stairs and into the rooms that had held only silence for 2 years. Julian stood in the doorway as he had stood in another doorway long ago, impatient, then to be gone. He was not impatient now. He came and stood behind her, with his hands on her shoulders, facing the music she was making, and Thomas leaned against the bench at her side, and she played her father's song to its end in a house that was no longer cold. On the small table beside the instrument, where she had set it that evening and meant to leave it always, stood the miniature of a young man with a violin tucked under his chin and his eyes full of some private music, watching his daughter at last in a room where the music had begun again. That night, with the boy asleep and the house quiet and warm around them, Julian found her in the music room still, her hand resting on the closed lid. And he said her name, only her name, Cassandra, the way he had been saving it. She turned. The fire had burned low and the spring dark pressed soft against the windows, and he crossed the small distance between them, and there was no room to perform for, and no verdict left to wait on. Only the two of them, and the instrument, and the boy asleep, upstairs. He raised his hand and let it stop a breath from her face. The old inch, the chasm, the world had forbidden, and this time there was no world left to forbid it. She closed the inch herself. She put her cheek against his hand and then her mouth against his, soft and full of every promise the months had built and neither had been permitted to say, and his arms came around her at last, and the cold man was not cold, had never been cold, had only been waiting in the dark under the ice for someone to see that the river was still running. If Cassandra's story has stayed with you, if you have ever been a person a room decided about before you spoke, leave a word at the end with the moment that moved you most. It is a small thing and it means a great deal. They were married in the small church on the estate, in the first week of summer, with Thomas carrying the ring and Mrs. and R. Finch weeping into her bombazine, and the household, who had loved the new governess long before the Duke admitted he did, gathered close in the pews. There was no great crowd. The Duke had had enough of great crowds to last his life. There was only the people who were glad, which is a different and better thing. And afterward, in the long golden evening, the new Duchess of Harrogate sat at her father's old music, with her husband behind her and her son at her side, and played until the candles guttered and the house listened and the river ran on, under no ice at all, free and dark and singing, all the way to the sea.